Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. And I would like to welcome all of you to this intimate book review briefing combination. I'm very honored personally to have my friend Mehran Kamrava here today. We've known each other for many years, and I have great respect for him, just same that you would just from looking at his CV. Mehran is professor right now and director of the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar, the campus in Doha. And he is a well-known author. For those, most of you in the room that I know are students of the Middle East, if you will, or observers of the region. He's a well-known, very prolific writer on topics that are dear to all of us, actually. I'm totally fascinated, frankly. I don't know how he does it, but when you look back at the last 6 or 7 years, he has authored so many different publications and a whole range of issues that he covered, from the Gulf to Palestine to the Arab Spring to Qatar to international policy in the region. So we're really indeed very happy and very honored to have him here. And today he's going to talk about his kind of most recent publication, if you will. And let me show you Inside the Arab State, which to me, frankly, I haven't read it fully yet, but I've skimmed through it and looked at the reviews and the coverage of the publication. It's one of the most authoritative explanation of what's happening within the Arab world, particularly within each state post, if you will, Arab Spring that I have ever seen. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of books that have emerged since then. I would recommend it for those of you who are still looking. I mean, the situation is still unfolding. We look around us in the Arab world, and we're still trying to explain as to what happened. Why did, first of all, Arab Spring take place? Why did it succeed or fail in certain parts of the Arab world? Why did states or some states get so offended by it and suppress, if you will, the results in their favor, if you will, security-wise? So all these questions are issues that are dealt with very authoritatively in this publication, and I would recommend it to you and to our viewers out there on the website. So with that short introduction, and I know most of you are familiar and have had an ongoing relationship with our guest today, but again, I'd like to welcome Professor Mehran Kamrava and appreciate him taking time out of his busy schedule. He has another event immediately after that, and I'm sure we'll have a few more minutes after his presentation to exchange some views, engage in the art of conversation. Mehran, please.
Thank you so much. Let me start by thanking Khalil for his warm hospitality and the entire team at the Arab Center in Washington, particularly Lana Katan, who's been so instrumental in facilitating this meeting, and I'm really, truly grateful to Khalil and his team. It's an honor being here and speaking before an audience, many of whom I've quoted extensively in this book and I've learned from over the years. Let me just tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book, and I'll highlight 2 of the arguments, and then we'll have time for conversation. I wrote the book because of a series of questions that I wanted to answer in the back of my mind. Primarily, the question that animated the whole project was what went wrong. Why did the Arab Spring turn out the way it did? And then what is it? There's often this discussion about Middle Eastern exceptionalism. Is there indeed something in the Middle East that resulted in these uprisings going the way they did. And with this being my starting point, I looked at social movements and how social movements appear and how they evolve and unfold over time. And over the course of my studies, I traveled, as Khalil mentioned, I'm based in Doha. I traveled to many parts of the region and spoke to many academics and average, ordinary people. And it occurred to me that social movements can evolve into something much bigger than they originally intended to be. And social movements can oftentimes evolve into revolutions. These are revolutions that you might call spontaneous revolutions. They don't necessarily have leaders at the beginning. They don't have ideologies. They don't have set organization. They simply happen. They snowball with people getting together in one city square and then some people dying. Those become martyrs for a cause. And eventually, as time goes by, these social movements begin to evolve and develop into spontaneous revolutions. And as that is happening, they also develop leaders who tend to be more articulate, more opportunistic, better organizers. And this is what we see in a place like Tunisia and Egypt. And we also saw this in Yemen, and we saw the beginnings of a social movement in Bahrain. And social movements can have several directions. Oftentimes they are single issue movements whereby they peter out or that issue is addressed. For example, the Gezi Park movement in Turkey is an example. Or they revolve around one issue. Sometimes they evolve into revolutions, as the examples I gave you demonstrate. And then sometimes they evolve into something quite pernicious. They evolve or they degenerate into civil wars, because what happens is they give people a sense of empowerment, but those who run the political show, the leaders of the state, are not willing to give up. And so you come to this situation of negative equilibrium whereby people are empowered and want more, and the state is weakened, but not necessarily so weakened as to be overthrown. And this civil war is what we saw happen in Syria. And of course, we saw this in Libya for slightly different reasons, because there were also fractions among these groups that were mobilizing. So I realized that from a lens or perspective of social movements, the Arab uprisings of 2011 could be well explained. And over the course of these social movements, I also discovered that the coercive institutions of the state, in other words, the armed forces, play a determining role in the course of events as they evolve. So if the armed forces have a corporate identity, if they are united, they can either stick with the state or defect from it. And so we saw that they defected the Mubarak presidency and the Ben Ali presidency. And so when the armed forces defected, the revolution happened. Or they can stay with the state in a weakened form, as we saw in Syria. And then we saw the fracturing, the disintegration of the armed forces along regional lines in places, or other lines of division in places like Libya and in Yemen. So the armed forces play a decisive role. And that, in many ways, explains, in very broad terms, the political landscape that we see today in much of the Arab world, with revolutions that happened. Now, it turned out that one of those revolutions was reversed in Egypt by elements from within the former state, the most cohesive, the most corporate element, namely the armed forces. When they saw the direction and the evolution of the revolution, they stepped in and made sure to reverse the trend. And in Tunisia, we're seeing a gradual incremental evolution, seemingly in a democratic direction, and but we don't necessarily know that the final chapter of that evolution hasn't been written yet, and we don't know where Tunisia's Arab Spring would end up. The signs so far have been extremely promising, but there are multiple variables that we don't necessarily know. Let me just highlight, if I may, one other thing. I relied extensively. There's a chapter in the book called the Contested Terrain, in which I look extensively at Arab public opinion. The Arab Center for Policy Studies and Research in Doha has done all of us, students of the Middle East, a huge favor by putting out an annual public opinion survey. And I relied extensively on that public opinion survey from, I believe, 2016, which was the last year that was available when I was working on the book. And I looked at the public opinion across the Arab world over the course of 6 years that the Arab Spring had transpired. And I discovered something interesting. When you ask the average person in the street what their biggest concern is, two factors stand out. First and foremost, the economy, particularly the money they have in their pocketbook. And second, security. Not just security in financial terms, but in physical terms. So then you ask the average person what they think about democracy, and the answer you get is uniformly that everybody is democratic. And the whole notion of democracy is universally valued and upheld. But then you ask a couple of deeper questions that probe the question of democracy a little deeper. For example, are you willing to allow people of religious faith that are different from yours to make decisions that have consequences for your life? And there the answer is more is not as clear cut. There the picture is far more complex. Or you ask people, would you be willing to have policies made by someone whom you did not vote for, but won an election? And again, there the answer is a little bit more nuanced and rocky. And what that tells me is that as a democratic experiment, the 2000 uprisings did not necessarily succeed. They made the discourse, they made the narrative of the countries that were affected by them more polarized, more diametrically opposed to each other. But they didn't do much, obviously, as we've seen since, to encourage democratic values and the internalization of these democratic values. And unfortunately, one of the things we see is lack of commitment to democratic values on the part of elites, cultural elites, of course political elites, but also opinion makers. And while there is this kind of wonderful discussion about how good democracy is, once you get into a little bit deeper discussion of it, those questions become somewhat more problematic. So ultimately what all of this means is that for the foreseeable future, we're likely to see continued authoritarianism in much of the Middle East, and we're likely to see instances of political instability, because people obviously want democracy. They may not quite know what democracy means in terms of what that means in practice or how do you go about practicing it, but certainly the yearning for democratic values and free political space is there, whereas we see a continuation of non-democratic political systems, and that is likely to create political tensions as we look ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, appreciate that. Let me begin by asking you, a lot has been written since Arab Spring about the fact that the last chapter has not been written, and the possibility of Arab Spring 2.0. From your perspective, having done this research, having focused on this issue, what are the prospects of an Arab Spring 2.0?
That's an excellent question. People who have not been through an uprising usually yearn for an uprising. People who have been through it, people who have sacrificed their daily routine, have not gone to work but instead gone to demonstrate, people who have paid the political price of political activism, are reluctant within living memory to once again engage in it. So a likelihood of that reoccurrence of people pouring into Tahrir Square or Pearl Square that doesn't exist, or other public spaces in such strong numbers and asking for yearning, asking for political change in that form, I think is unlikely. However, if we look at past historical experiences, we see that there is, if you take a longer term historical horizon and look at longer term, oftentimes you see these as really the beginning of social changes, the beginning of changes in mentalities, in narratives that have longer term consequences. So we may not necessarily see an Arab Spring 2.0, but we could very well see within our lifetime the fruition of some of the ideals that inspired people to protest in the Arab Spring, largely because the ideas, the discourse hasn't died down. The genie is out of the bag. It's almost like you've squeezed the toothpaste out of the tube. You can't necessarily squeeze it back in. The mentality is there. The yearning is there. Will it take the same form? I sincerely doubt it, but probably through, for example, inter-elite negotiations and dialogue among the elite, of the kind we're seeing in a place like Tunisia, or we're seeing a much more prolonged and much more violent form of this elite negotiations and dialogue in Iran, whereby you have the so-called reformists, the so-called principalists, and they go back and forth. And the people are interested observers, sometimes participants. That is much more likely to happen.
Aside from the elite interaction that could determine the next phase, with the growing intolerance of freedom of expression, particularly media, ability to kind of portray these issues freely to the public. How do you see, with this increased oppression, if you will, and control, how do you see the role of the public, being able to express itself the way it did earlier in the first Arab Spring?
With great difficulty. I think one of the things we're seeing today is that the traditional media has died down, or is no longer, it hasn't died down, but is no longer as trusted and as consequential as before. The new media has provided new space and new forms of expression. And so that is extremely difficult to clamp down on, no matter how determined the state might be to put a lid on this public discourse. And I think we might see different forms of political participation, different forms of political expression, which would be extremely difficult people to, for states to control, particularly the narrative. Nowadays, somebody in some political figure in Cairo or even Tehran or some places says something. Next thing you know, there's a meme about it on the internet circulating around. And so I think the nature of politics is beginning to change.
Before we proceed with the art of conversation here and giving you the chance to ask questions directly, I think we'll go ahead and do it. If you've already used your card, please pass them on. If you prefer to ask your question, we're a small group today, so it will be fine to go ahead. Just raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you and we can proceed with that. But let me have these first. Okay, Professor Kamrava was gracious to mention the Arab index, opinion index, and this is one of the projects at the Doha Institute that we are extremely proud of. And we have used it ourselves. We've done a couple of projects from here using the same mechanism. But the fact that it is being done annually, cutting across at least the last survey, the 16-17, that Mehran referred to, covered 12 Arab countries. That is rare at the same time, and basically done face-to-face interviews in countries that usually do not even allow public opinion to be measured, and so we're glad to have that. I just wanted to mention to you that the executive summary of the last survey is available on our website. So if you like to familiarize yourself with that, it's basically Arab Center, dc.org, and look at public opinion polls, and you will see the executive summary mentioned there. For those of you who are technically more interested in the detail, I would refer you to our colleagues' website, the Arab Center in Doha, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, ACRPS, and they do have some of the data itself from that survey in detail available on their website. Some of it is in Arabic, some of it is in English, but our executive summary is in English. So please refer to that if you're interested in public opinion. We have a question. Was the Arab Spring a success or a failure in general? Where was it a success and where was it a failure? I know you referred to briefly. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, political scientists like me are trained not to think in terms of success or failure, but cause and consequence. It depends. I think Sisi would say it was a success. Surely for him it was a success. If you were on the losing side, then it wasn't a success. But I do think it is, from a historical perspective, I think it's part of it's a part of historical development which will not be forgotten. It will be an interesting 50 years we're going to be sitting here and looking at 2010, 2011 as a historical critical juncture, as that point in history where a rare opportunity was presented to institution makers and state builders to craft political systems and do it right. And it seems like in Tunisia, they are getting it right in a very deliberative, incremental process whereby they're looking at, they're involving different sides and different discussions. Elsewhere, I think what we've seen in places like Bahrain, there's a retrenchment of authoritarianism. I think it's difficult to describe what is unfolding in Syria or in Yemen as anything other than a tragedy, a human tragedy of unfathomable proportions. So in some ways, in some respects, Arab Spring, of course, was a success, and we're seeing that success unfold in Tunisia. But I think elsewhere it has had very dark consequences.
Go ahead, please.
Tom.
Go ahead, identify yourself,
Tom,
please.
at Least Institute. Mehran, when you first sent me this book, I was very skeptical about the idea of generalizing about the Arab state writ large because of the great differences in system. I think you made that point, right? The characteristics that you assembled. So I want to get country specific for a minute, and guess which country it is. At the end, you talk about the state survival. One of the elements of state survival, regime survival, is the cohesion of the elite. Okay. But in Saudi Arabia, the state undertook a systematic attack on the elite, apparently unprovoked. So how does that fit into the pattern in which the cohesion of the elites is necessary to ensure the survival of the regime?
That's an excellent question. And I think neither I nor anyone else 2 years ago would have predicted what has unfolded in Saudi Arabia since. What the current Saudi leadership has done is to engage in a very sudden and very systematic dismantling of the Saudi deep state by basically rounding up all the key figures that occupied, if you will, the commanding heights of the deep state, all the other princes, and neutralizing them. Sometimes just through forced retirement, sometimes through imprisonment and others. And so what that has done is has fundamentally shaken, I believe, the foundations of the institutional foundations of the Saudi state. So I quite agree with you. Now, what Mohammed bin Salman has done to compensate, or probably not necessarily intentionally, but if there is a counterbalance to kind of this unsettling of the foundations of the Saudi state, is that he has gone directly to the middle class urban Saudis in places in the big cities. So he has gone to the young in Jeddah, Riyadh, and other Saudi cities by initiating a series of reforms that, by all accounts, seem to be popular, if we are to believe what we're seeing from Saudi Arabia. So, although he may not have institutional support, it appears that at least he has relatively meaningful popular support among the population. And now, whether or not that popular support is sufficient to help him maintain power or carry out his agendas, I think the jury is out on that, and that is yet to be seen. But you're absolutely right that he has completely unmoored the foundations of the Saudi state by dismantling this deep state. If I may just take 1 minute to elaborate on this, this notion of deep state, I think the best example of it was Turkey, whereby the military was the dominant power behind the scenes. And what Erdogan did over the course of nearly a decade was to systematically chip away at this deep state in a way that was least destabilizing to the Turkish political system, and this incremental dismantling of the military's ability to call the shots from behind the scenes. And we see that Mohammed bin Salman did it really in the course of a few months. And that is what's destabilizing in Saudi Arabia, at least has left the Saudi state quite vulnerable, and it has taken away from the Saudi state institutional advice. So we see that the Saudi state has been going, at least in international relations, it's been going from one unmitigated disaster to another. Everything from the war in Yemen to the blockade on Qatar to the arrest of and imprisonment of the Prime Minister of Lebanon to the Khashoggi affair. And so he has made himself, he has rid himself of this advice that he could have gotten, but at the same time that has given him a free hand to implement his policies.
If I may add just a follow-up on this, do you believe that this historic social, maybe, contract between Al Saud and the religious establishment is defunct now as a result?
Well,
he unmoved it,
yeah, absolutely. I am reminded of this khutbah that was just given in the Grand Mosque by a notable Saudi cleric, saying that this reformer is divinely ordained. I mean, this is unbelievable. I don't know where the Saudi religious establishment stands today. I think you're absolutely right. Whether or not it's a contract or an understanding, I think if this continues, I think it would be meaningless really to talk about a Saudi religious establishment. It has now definitely become an appendage of the state.
We have a question related to the earlier one. Ronald, what's the last name? Le? Yeah, Le. Why do militaries defect or not, in terms of their role, particularly in Arab Spring?
That's an excellent question. If the military, like any other actor, is rational, so the military leadership looks around and says, how can my interests best be preserved or served? And so in Tunisia, the military made a decision that if we abandon the costs of sticking with the leader, what are the pros and the cons? And if the costs outweigh the benefits, then the military defects. And this is exactly what happened in Tunisia. The military looked around and said the reputational costs of sticking with Ben Ali are too high, and we're getting rid of him. And the military in Tunisia declared its neutrality, quote unquote, which meant that it decided not to side with Ben Ali or not to support Ben Ali anymore. In Egypt, the military's interests were not so much reputational as they were commercial. And again, the military looked around and saw these hundreds of thousands of people protesting and pouring out into the streets day after day, and figured it's a very simple calculation. We'll get rid of Mubarak, we will preserve our own interests. And when they realized that their interests were being undermined by Morsi, then they stepped in as an institution. So I think their corporate interests become the guiding factor as to whether or not they defect or not.
Okay, Bill also is asking, how do you explain the recent decision this week of Qatar to withdraw from OPEC, and how do you fit that in the larger picture that you depicted?
I moved to Qatar in 2007, and one of the things I had to learn, and it took me some time to learn this, was to never be surprised by what Qatar does, because Qatar specializes in surprising. Everything from its so-called maverick diplomacy throughout the 2000s to Sheikh Hamad's surprise retirement in 2013, and then the surprising resilience with which Qatar has conducted itself since 2017. And now, of course, the withdrawal from OPEC. I really don't know. I wish I had a crystal ball and I could look into it. The official reason is that Qatar is a small oil producer and they want to concentrate on LNG. you can buy them you can take them at face value, take that at face value. I think there's more behind the scenes that I certainly don't know. I know that the energy minister is a Qatari nationalist. He is extremely committed to furthering Qatar's national interest. Every time I talk to one of the oil executives from the multinational oil companies, they complain about him. They say he drives a very hard bargain, and this could definitely be motivated by Qatar's national interests. What those interests are, they have not yet been articulated. I don't have an answer to that question.
With your permission, I'm in the middle of writing to finish this afternoon an op-ed piece actually on that, explaining the Qatari decision to pull out. And I agree with you. You just pointed your finger to the kind of the central theme, which is the emergence of Qatari nationalism. I think what boycotting countries, boycotting Qatar, underestimated is the quick and crisp emergence of this nationalism in the region. It's not unique to Qatar, it's happening in other countries too, based on that conflict. But Qatar, that's the reason they survived, is because they resorted to that. They surprised themselves. But what you have today in Qatar is this young generation, and definitely Al-Kabi, the Minister of Energy, is one of them. These are people in their 20s and 30s that have been propelled by the force of this crisis, the GCC crisis, to take charge. They are basically being given the key positions in the country by the emir. In his wisdom, he saw that the answer lies with this generation. And I go over there, I interact with delegations when they come here, and it's amazing. Kids, quote unquote, in their 20s are running the show today in Qatar. And the way they view these things are totally different from what their fathers or uncles or what have you did view that. So they are looking at the role of Qatar in OPEC as having changed, that they admit, they're very practical, they admit that they are a very small player in the oil business, and they feel that they are wasting their time being there because frankly they feel OPEC has degenerated into a one-country controlled organization that receives a phone call from certain countries, say raise the price, lower the price, and they say yes sir. And they feel that there is absolutely no self-redeeming value for their continued presence there. They strategically, as the energy minister said, they are focusing on what counts. And what counts right now is gas, liquefied gas. They are the largest country in the world doing that. That's why they are the richest country in the world per capita right now. And they want to focus their energy into increasing that, solidifying that, and making that even more, translate that more into power politics, if you will, in terms of how they view their future. So anyway, thank you for allowing me to add that. But
No,
Maya,
thank you.
Maya Ormsby, who chairs an NGO that operates in the MENA area, asks, what role does the scarcity of natural resources, including water, or in particular water, and the relatively high birth rates, young people, and the majority being the majority in these countries, play in the conflicts and the future of Arab state?
That's an excellent question. There is a whole school of thought that the Arab Spring was precipitated by continuous drought. Syria had the worst drought in 10 years, that right before the Arab uprising. Egypt, of course, had great difficulties. And some of the uprisings, the scattered protests that we see in Iran, are surely can be traced to the environmental degradations that Iran has been experiencing over the last couple of decades. This is likely to continue. There is very little that is being done, and I think these issues are not going away. They're only being aggravated. These are countries. These are issues to which policymakers do not pay the attention that needs to be paid, because they're not glitzy, they don't attract, they're not showy projects, and I think this is going to continue to be one of the biggest issues that we're going to have to be dealing with. In the region where I am, in the Arabian Peninsula, the countries are wealthy enough to have water desalination plants, but there's an acute shortage of sand, believe it or not. After water, sand is the most used natural resource. And all these buildings that are going up, the sand that you see in the Arabian Peninsula is not necessarily the kind that can be used for concrete. So we don't have a shortage of water, although there are severe environmental consequences to water desalination plants. But at least water, there's no shortage of water. The shortage that there is of sand, believe it or not.
That's interesting. Mustafa, go ahead.
My question originally was the notion of the deep state, but since you addressed it, I just want to make a follow-up. What's the role of conspiracy theories in the region, especially the people's perception? And it should be related with the fact that there is a big role of the deep state, whether we could talk about the intelligence services or the state regimes or the military such as a powerful coercive institution. But what is really the role of this, what could be the consequences to have such powerful conspiracy theory everyday fight in coffee houses in our world?
That's an excellent question. I'm from Iran, and I travel there as often as I can. And every time I travel to Iran, I find that I have to debunk conspiracy theories of one form or another. And they're very pervasive. And unfortunately, the spread of social media has only facilitated their spread. And these conspiracy theories, as I'm sure you agree, they have developed, oftentimes they develop a life of their own. And what happens is sometimes policymakers find themselves on the defensive and they have to respond to these conspiracy theories. Some states actually are very cleverly use them or try to use them to their advantage. They have these whispering operations whereby they either say the price of bread is going up and see how people will react. So conspiracy theories are a fact of political life in the Middle East, in any, well, I was going to say in any authoritarian system, but we seem to be in the epicenter of conspiracy theories here in Washington, D.C. these days. So
It is authoritarian. It's changed since you were last here.
So conspiracy theories are something that states have to actively either respond to or manipulate or even initiate. And it has become one of those essential tools for governance in these states. You either have to respond to it or somehow you have to engage with it.
Dr. Amran?
Well, talking about conspiracy theory, how do you evaluate the external factors, regional and international, foreign and regional, affecting the modern Arab state out of your deep state?
That's an excellent question. Actually, when I was working on this book, I went to, my trips included Tunisia and Algeria. And when I was in Tunisia, when I was in Algeria, I was giving a talk and I said, Tunisia is blessed because at least as far as the Americans are concerned, it doesn't have the same strategic significance for them that some of the other countries do. Because if it had the strategic significance that Egypt, for example, does, we saw that there was much more direct involvement by the United States in the unfolding of Egypt's uprising as compared to Tunisia, for example. And the fact that, of course, the French are concerned about Tunisia, but they're not as intimately involved, or they were not, at least in 2011, in trying to influence directly or indirectly the course of events as they were unfolding or as they have unfolded since. So I think part of the problem of the countries of the Middle East is the curse of strategic significance, the fact that they are seen as, or are in fact, so important strategically to much larger, more powerful international players that seek to shape or influence in one form or another domestic developments within them. And so as a result, we see the I was one of the things that I discovered over the course of doing the research was that the list of candidates for parliamentary elections in Bahrain, the list of who can be a candidate used to, I'm sure at the time of the book, I see no reason why things would have changed since, goes to Riyadh, is vetted by the Saudi court, and then is sent back to Manama as to who can run and who cannot run. So we see that this relationship of between powerful and less powerful, patron and client, occurs at different levels, whether it's between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia and the United States, or Egypt and the US. And a country like Tunisia that seems to not have the same strategic significance is then left on its own to figure out its own contradictions internally. And as a result, we see some really interesting developments happen there.
In the earliest assessments of Arab Spring, a lot was made of the fact that the young people who took charge and were the actual foot soldiers of Arab Spring did not have the sufficient political experience to translate their wishes and desires into an actual political program. And that's why, in a way, they failed. Did your research
Yes,
confirm that?
absolutely, absolutely. There's a couple of things. Revolutions give rise to a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of raw energies. But the ability to overthrow a state doesn't necessarily translate into the ability to run a state. So there are two very different skill sets. To go and protest in the street and be united over a negative, down with Mubarak or down with Ben Ali, then it is to be united over something, okay, how do we organize the day after? How do we take this, how does tomorrow look? And so you see that revolutions, over the course of revolutions, you have somebody who emerges either through superior organization or charisma or whatever as the leaders. And at the same time, revolutions are not for the faint of heart. We had one of these guys who was the idol of the Egyptian young, and every time he would get upset, he'd leave the country. His name, of course, was El-Beradai. And here was someone who had the international stature, the international persona, and the support of the young. And in the middle of it, he would get up and go to Vienna, and he would be upset or whatever. And so those who had the organizational ability at the grassroots level, the Muslim Brotherhood, or those who owned the guns and the butters, the bread and the guns, those are the ones who could effect change at the street level, either the military or those who could mobilize the votes.
Okay, any other questions, staff? I know I ignored a couple of hands from the staff. Till later, go ahead, Herman.
I admittedly, I only read about half the book so far, but I did not see a whole lot of emphasis on the issue of economics, really. You know, we're talking about elites. I mean, what kind of elites are we talking about? The issue of private sector versus public sector. All these things are rather important to understand how the state or its institutions work, suppress, or collapse. I mean, am I missing something here that you know, elites come from a certain socioeconomic strata, or are nurtured to be so in a certain state or in another? So I mean, can you shed some more light on that?
Sure. I do talk about the economy, perhaps not as much as I should, but there are parts of the book that elaborate on this rather extensively. First, I discuss a fair amount the Egyptian military's economic interests. There's also one of the things we see is that there is, at least in Syria, there was half-hearted economic liberalization or privatization, and a campaign that unfolded. And what does that mean? It means the government selling a hotel or selling an insurance company or selling some state-owned enterprise. To whom? To those with connections. So one of the richest men in Syria is the cousin of the president, who owns the mobile network. And so you have these oligarchs that are the economic elite, but they become a liability for the state because they provide, not because of their conspicuous consumption, they provide easily identifiable targets of popular anger at a time when people are living from salary to salary. So obviously, I think the role of the elite is important. It's also very important when we go to the Arabian Peninsula. One of the things I had to do, which goes back to Tom's perceptive comment earlier, is I discovered that the states of the Gulf region have a very different pattern of evolution. They evolved very differently. There are organic links between whatever there is of a state and society. And that these organic links oftentimes take two forms, either through marriage and kinship bonds or commercial and business linkages that link state and society together. And as a result, you had tremendous adaptability on the part of the state because the business community is intimately linked and connected to those in the highest echelons of the state. And so, yes, I think you raise a very important question, and I think that's very important.
Okay, let's conclude with this substantive question that Ronald Levin is back with additional question here. Are there anywhere in the Arab world community-level organizations that could ever support the evolution toward other than authoritarian regimes or governments?
Yes, there are, and that's an excellent question. I think I'll answer that question by pointing to the obvious. What do we mean by democracy? By democracy, we mean the ability to agree to disagree, agreeing to disagree. And so oftentimes what we see is at the local level, we have these local organizations or other organizations that come to some sort of modus vivendi. They come to some sort of understanding. They may not necessarily agree with each other, but for whatever reason, they figure that they have to work together and agree. And I think at the local level, oftentimes we have these different opinions. We have these different priorities and agendas that have had to somehow accommodate one another. And once there's that local level accommodation, in political science parlance, sometimes we call it civil society. If you have this civil society, then if it spreads enough at a society-wide level that's extensive enough to put pressures on the state, then the state has to respond accordingly. This is precisely what happened in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, what happened in Latin America at around the same time, and I cannot see why it won't happen in the Middle East. The ingredients are there, but the political will isn't there.
I do agree with that answer particularly. I think quite a few states or societies in the Arab world seem to me to be stuck as a student of the region between this development of sufficiently effective civil society on the one hand and the democratic yearning, which is actually strong, even though we deny it in the West. We are not aware of it. And I would again refer you to the Arab Opinion Index, particularly the section on democracy and how people in the Arab world, individuals, how the Arab street feels about democracy, what it entails. So there is a sophisticated understanding of democracy in the Arab world, but the tools, the means, civil society is still missing. With that said, I'd like again to thank Mehran for his generosity today and spending this time with us. Thank you for being here and engaging in this conversation. Please join me in thanking Professor Kamrava.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.